Have you ever pondered the idea that race and the practice of racialization both might be something we should end? That the causes and effects of racism require our continued upholding of race and the practice of assigning races to the human species? Today we delve into the thought-provoking philosophy of racial eliminativism, the idea that we should eradicate what some call social constructs like so-called race from our conceptual framework. This audacious perspective challenges our everyday understanding of identity and society. This intriguing notion, known as racial eliminativism, has a rich and complex history, particularly in African American thought. Before we continue, subscribe for more educational content, hit the like and share buttons to support the channel. The roots of racial eliminativism in African American thought can be traced back to the era of chattel slavery and the fight for abolition. It's a deep and complex history, one that is rooted in the struggle for basic human rights and dignity. In the mid-19th century, figures like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth emerged as powerful voices against the institution of chattel slavery. They grappled with the concept of race in a society that saw them as less than human because of the race that society assigned to those of more recent African descent. Douglass, a former enslaved person, used his experiences to challenge anti-black racism, arguing that no so-called race is inherently superior or inferior to another. He did so from a Reconstructionist position, the belief that we can reform what so-called race is and how it manifests. Truth used her platform to highlight the intersectionality of racism and sexism. As a woman who got racialized as black, she fought against both racialized and gendered discrimination, asserting that the fight for so-called racial equality was also a fight for gender equality. She too approached abolitionism from a Reconstructionist position. Both of them, and many others like them, were not just fighting against chattel slavery, they were fighting for a society where so-called race did not determine a person's worth or opportunities. This vision was, at its core, a form of racial eliminativism, a world where race was eliminated, though they could not have advocated for a world without racism in eliminativist terms, since belief in biological race was dominant at that time. The fight for abolition was intertwined with the fight for equality. Abolishing chattel slavery was a significant step, but it did not automatically lead to equality. African Americans were still discriminated against. Their rights were still limited, and they were still seen as inferior due to the race society imposed onto them. This tension between so-called racial identity and the desire for a post-racial, aka a post-racist society, has been a recurring theme in African American thought. It's a tension born out of the struggle for equality, the fight against discrimination, and the hope for a world where race no longer matters, which means the hope for a world where anti-black racism no longer exists. It's a tension that continues to shape African American perspectives on racial eliminativism to this day. Between the official movements for human rights in the United States, many African Americans still mobilized against inequality and injustice, making the movement for civil rights constant to this day. The periodization of history can be misleading for some, but for the sake of time, let's fast forward to the Civil Rights era, where the debate around racial eliminativism and what we should do with race took on new dimensions. This period in American history was marked by a surge of activism, with the civil rights movement bringing the issue of racial eliminativism to the forefront of national consciousness. It was during this time that influential figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X emerged, each with their unique perspectives on racial eliminativism that often get missed by the vast majority of people. King championed a seemingly colorblind society, where people were judged by their character, not their race, which really can be translated into championing a raceless world, since the very presence of so-called race signifies the presence of racism. Malcolm X advocated for so-called racial pride and self-determination, a stance that some might argue leans away from eliminativism. But he embraced eliminativist philosophies right before his assassination, when he sought to unify the people, all people, against oppressive systems. These types of viewpoints sparked intense debates and further deepened the discourse around identity and its role in society. Despite the progress made during the Civil Rights era, the question of racial eliminativism remains as relevant and controversial as ever. Today, the debate around racial eliminativism continues, with scholars, activists, and everyday people grappling with its implications. As we delve deeper into the 21st century, the discourse around racial eliminativism is taking center stage, fueled by a society increasingly aware of the limitations of reforming race and colorblindness, which allows race to exist within its paradigm, which means that racism persists too. In the modern era, racial eliminativism has been viewed through multiple lenses. Some see it as a pathway to a post-racial, that is, a post-racist, society. Others, however, argue that eliminating the concept of race may lead to the erasure of rich cultural histories and identities, and could potentially ignore the systemic racism that still persists. Until now, there has not been a pathway toward truth and liberation, or the end of racisms, particularly anti-Black racism. The rise of digital media has given a platform to diverse voices, effectively democratizing the conversation around racial eliminativism and any other presumed pathway toward a future without racism, a future without the belief in race and practice of assigning races to the human species as either a social construct or as something biological. Social media, blogs, and online forums have become arenas where people from all walks of life can share their perspectives, contributing to a potentially more nuanced and inclusive dialogue. As we continue to navigate the complexities of humanity and identity, the concept of racial eliminativism remains a critical part of the conversation. The theory of racelessness is a new and radical framework that includes and presents all ways of seeing race and shows how eliminativism is the most viable path to a future without anti-Black racism. From the era of slavery to the modern day, racial eliminativism has been a thought-provoking and controversial concept. We've journeyed briefly through early African American perspectives, navigated the civil rights era, and explored modern-day thoughts. Each era, with its unique challenges and triumphs, has shaped and reshaped the discourse around racial eliminativism and what we should do with race. This complex history underscores the importance of understanding racial eliminativism in African American thought. In understanding the history of racial eliminativism, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of race, identity, and the ongoing fight for equality. As importantly, we expand our imaginations to consider what could be rather than what hasn't been.